The salt-stained windows of the Tampa police station reflected the tired eyes of Detective Marcus Webb on that humid October morning in 1941. 23 years. That's how long the Eleanor Hartwell case had haunted this city, collecting dust in a filing cabinet on the third floor while life moved on around it. Eleanor had been 26 years old when she vanished from the Ybor City marketplace on a Tuesday afternoon, leaving behind nothing but whispers and a mother's unrelenting grief. Marcus was 52 now, close to retirement, with calloused hands and a liver-spotted face that told the story of too many sleepless nights pursuing ghosts. He'd inherited the Hartwell file 5 years ago from Detective Sullivan, who'd passed it along like a cursed relic. Most cops didn't want it. The case had consumed Sullivan's career, turned him bitter and alcoholic, and eventually landed him in an early grave at 61. Marcus understood why they avoided it. Some mysteries seemed designed to break you from the inside. But Marcus had never been good at letting go. The morning had started like any other, with lukewarm coffee and the weight of paperwork. He was reviewing arrest records from the 1930s, a routine he'd performed hundreds of times, when something caught his eye. A name, a face in a mugshot. A man named Thomas Greville, arrested in 1940 for vagrancy in Jacksonville, carrying a woman's jewelry he couldn't adequately explain. The description matched partially. Dark hair, tall, strong build. But what made Marcus's pulse quicken wasn't the jewelry or the vague physical similarity. It was the address listed on the arrest report. Greville had been living 3 blocks from where Eleanor Hartwell's body had been found in 1939. Not reported missing until 1941, but discovered buried beneath the floorboards of an abandoned warehouse during renovation work. Marcus had learned long ago not to trust coincidences. Coincidences were the universe playing tricks on the lazy-minded. He spent the next 6 hours digging through records, cross-referencing names, dates, and movements. Greville had disappeared from Jacksonville in 1940, right after that arrest. No subsequent records, no new arrests, nothing. It was as if he'd simply evaporated, which in a way suggested guilt. A man running, a man with something to hide. By noon, Marcus had made a decision. He contacted the Jacksonville Police Department and discovered something remarkable. Thomas Greville had recently surfaced. He was working as a dock hand in Fort Pierce, living under an assumed name, Thomas Gray. But an observant patrol officer had noticed the resemblance during a routine check and ran the fingerprints out of curiosity. The fingerprints matched. 23 years later, Thomas Greville was still in Florida, just 50 miles away, living a quiet life as if he'd never murdered a young woman and buried her like garbage beneath rotting wood and darkness. The drive to Fort Pierce took 3 hours. Marcus drove alone, his old Chevrolet rattling along the coastal highway, the Atlantic Ocean glimmering to his right like a mirror reflecting a sky too blue for a day that felt this heavy with consequence. He'd learned not to get his hopes up. Evidence deteriorated. Witnesses died or forgot. The legal system was a beast with appetites that didn't always align with justice. But Eleanor Hartwell's mother, Ruth, was still alive. She lived in a small house near Hyde Park, visiting her daughter's grave every Sunday without fail, according to the local priest. Ruth deserved an answer. At 78, she might not have many more Sundays left. Thomas Greville, or Thomas Gray, as the dock workers called him, was a thin man with gray threading through his dark hair and a tremor in his left hand that suggested either age or guilt or some combination of both. He was loading cargo onto a merchant vessel when Marcus found him, muscles straining beneath a sweat-soaked shirt, his movements methodical and careful. Marcus watched him for 10 minutes from a distance, studying the way Greville moved, the way he avoided eye contact with his coworkers, the way he seemed to inhabit the world as if he didn't quite belong to it. When Marcus finally approached, Greville's face went white. Not the white of innocent surprise. The white of a man watching his past materialize before him in the form of a detective with cold eyes and a badge that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Thomas Greville? Marcus's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of 2 decades. Greville's hands stilled on the cargo crate. For a moment he didn't move. Then slowly he turned around. His eyes met Marcus's, and in that meeting, something ancient and terrible seemed to pass between them. Recognition. Reckoning. The end of a long, exhausting game. I don't know that name, Greville said, but his voice cracked like dry earth. Yes, you do, Marcus replied. And I think you know why I'm here too. The arrest happened without struggle. Greville seemed almost relieved, as if carrying the weight of Eleanor Hartwell's ghost for 23 years had been a sentence he'd been waiting all along to serve. He didn't resist when Marcus read him his rights. He didn't protest when they put him in the back of the police car. He simply sat in silence, staring out the window at the ocean receding behind them, his trembling left hand pressed against his thigh, as if trying to hold something in. The news spread through Tampa like wildfire. Within hours, every newspaper from Jacksonville to Miami had picked it up. The cold case that had defined a generation of detective work had finally produced an arrest. Eleanor Hartwell's photograph appeared in the afternoon editions. A young woman with gentle eyes and a tentative smile, forever 26, frozen in time. The community that had moved on, that had relegated the mystery to the realm of urban legend and ghost story, suddenly remembered. They remembered Eleanor. They remembered the fear that had gripped Ybor City in 1939 when her body was discovered. They remembered the promise that justice would eventually arrive. And now it had, in the form of a tired old detective and a man who'd been running so long he'd almost forgotten what he was running from. The interrogation room at the Tampa police station was small, claustrophobic, with beige walls that had absorbed decades of human desperation. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows across the metal table. Thomas Greville sat across from Marcus, his hands cuffed to the table, his trembling worse now. A court-appointed lawyer named David Feynman sat beside him, a young man in his 30s with an expensive suit and the kind of practiced indifference that came from defending guilty men. My client has nothing to say without, Feynman began, but Marcus raised a hand. Let him speak, Marcus said quietly. Sometimes a man needs to speak. Greville looked at his lawyer, who nodded reluctantly. Then he looked at Marcus, and something shifted in his expression. It was as if a dam had finally cracked, and 23 years of pressure was about to be released. How did you find me? Greville asked. His voice was hoarse, and used to confession. Jewelry, Marcus replied, sliding the mugshot across the table. You couldn't help yourself, could you? Kept wearing Eleanor's pearls. Greville's jaw tightened. He stared at the photograph as if seeing himself for the first time in decades. The younger version of himself. Desperate, haunted, the kind of man who murdered and ran and thought running would be enough. I didn't plan it, Greville said, and Marcus heard the rationalization beginning. They always started with I didn't plan it, as if planning made it worse, as if spontaneity was a kind of innocence. I was working at the warehouse back then, loading and unloading cargo. She came by looking for work, looking to earn some money for her mother. She was desperate, you understand? I could see it in her eyes. Marcus said nothing. He let silence do the work. I was younger then, Greville continued, his hands trembling so badly the cuffs rattled against the metal table. Angrier. I'd had a woman leave me, took everything I had, left me with nothing. And when I saw Eleanor, so beautiful, so full of possibility, I thought maybe I could have something. Maybe I could hold on to something that wouldn't leave me. You raped her, Marcus said flatly. Greville flinched. I loved her, he whispered. You raped her, Marcus repeated. And when she fought back, when she tried to leave, you killed her. You buried her beneath the floorboards like she was nothing, like she was garbage. I panicked, Greville said, and now tears were streaming down his face, but Marcus felt no sympathy. These tears were for himself, for the life he'd lost, not for Eleanor Hartwell and the life that had been stolen from her. I didn't mean to kill her. It was an accident. She hit her head when she fell, and I didn't know what to do. I was young and stupid and scared, and I buried her. I thought if no one found her, no one would know. I thought I could just leave and start over. You reported her missing, Marcus said, reading from his notes. Why? If you were trying to hide her, why report her missing? I didn't, Greville said. Her mother did. I read about it in the papers a week later and realized it was only a matter of time before someone found the body. But by then I was already planning to leave the city. Eleanor's mother came looking for her, Marcus said, and his voice hardened. She went to every police station, every hospital, every morgue in the city. She printed pictures. She offered a reward. For 23 years, Ruth Hartwell visited her daughter's grave every single Sunday. Every Sunday, Grieville. She never stopped looking. She never stopped hoping. Grieville looked away, unable to meet Marcus's eyes. Do you know what Ruth Hartwell did yesterday? Marcus continued. She fell down a flight of stairs in her home. The doctor said she might not walk again. She's 78 years old, and she spent the last 2 decades of her life with a destroyed heart because you couldn't control yourself, because you couldn't accept that a woman didn't want you. The lawyer put a hand on Greville's shoulder, a signal to stop talking, but Grieville ignored him. I tried to forget, Grieville said. I changed my name. I moved to Jacksonville. I worked different jobs. I lived simply, quietly, trying to be a better man. I told myself I was a better man. You weren't a better man, Marcus said. You were just a man who got away with murder. Until today. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. By the end, Grieville had confessed to everything. The rape, the murder, the burial, the decades of evasion. The lawyer advised him to recant everything, but Grieville refused. There was something almost peaceful about his resignation, as if speaking the truth had lifted a weight he'd been carrying all along. The news hit the Tampa community like a thunderclap. The headlines were everywhere. Cold case solved. Eleanor Hartwell killer arrested after 23 years. Local man confesses to 1939 murder. But the reaction wasn't simple celebration. It was more complex, more conflicted than that. In Ybor City, the old neighborhood where Eleanor had vanished, people gathered on street corners arguing about whether Grieville was truly guilty or if Marcus had fabricated evidence. A man named Carl Rodriguez, who'd known Grieville vaguely in those early days, swore the detective had pressured a false confession. Another witness, a woman named Patricia Chun who'd worked at the marketplace, insisted she'd always known Grieville was innocent, that he'd been a shy, quiet man, incapable of such violence. The doubts spread like poison through the community. Thomas Grieville had lived in Jacksonville for 23 years, working with the same men, living in the same neighborhood, keeping his head down. Some of his co-workers came forward to testify to his character. They called him reliable, honest, a good man. How could such a man be a murderer? How could they have worked alongside a killer all these years without knowing? Ruth Hartwell, Eleanor's mother, heard the whispers. She heard the doubts being voiced in her neighborhood, in the grocery stores, in the churches. Some people began to suggest that perhaps Marcus had gotten it wrong. Perhaps the real killer was still out there. Perhaps Eleanor's death would remain unsolved, a question mark that would haunt Tampa forever. The uncertainty festered. Ruth, recovering slowly from her fall, began to doubt everything. She'd prayed for justice for so long that, when it finally came, it didn't feel right. Felt wrong, suspicious, too convenient. Had Marcus fabricated evidence? Had Grieville confessed to a crime he didn't commit just to end the interrogation? Had the system failed her again, this time by convicting the wrong man? And Marcus himself, standing in his office late at night, staring at the confession transcript and the evidence file, began to wonder. He'd been so certain, so absolutely certain. But doubt, once planted, grows like a weed. The arrest that had promised closure had instead opened a new wound. The community was fractured. The truth seemed elusive, slipping through their fingers like water. Eleanor Hartwell's case, supposedly solved, suddenly felt more mysterious than ever. 3 days after the arrest, Marcus received a visitor at the police station. It was a woman in her 60s, dressed in a gray coat despite the Florida heat. Her hair pinned back severely, her eyes carrying the weight of 2 decades of grief. Ruth Hartwell moved slowly, leaning on a cane, her body still recovering from the fall. A young nurse accompanied her, offering an arm for support. Marcus stood to greet her, removing his hat, uncertain of what to say. He'd imagined this meeting 1,000 times, the mother of the victim thanking him, finding peace in justice. But Ruth's expression wasn't peaceful. It was tormented. "I need to know," Ruth said, settling into the chair across from Marcus's desk with difficulty. "I need to know if you're certain. I need to know if you really have the right man." Marcus felt something shift in his chest. "Mrs. Hartwell," he confessed. He provided details about Eleanor that only the killer would know. "What details?" Ruth asked sharply. "What did he say that proved it was him?" Marcus hesitated. He opened Eleanor's case file, reviewing the confession. Greville had mentioned Eleanor's pearl necklace, the warehouse location, the Tuesday afternoon. But as Marcus read through it again, something struck him as hollow. These were details that could have been in the newspapers. Details that anyone obsessed with the case could have learned. "Mrs. Hartwell," Marcus began carefully, "I understand your doubts, but the evidence—" "I don't want evidence," Ruth interrupted, her voice breaking. "I want the truth, and I can feel in my bones that something is wrong here. A mother knows. I knew when Eleanor was missing. I knew when they found her body. And I know now that something doesn't fit." After Ruth left, Marcus sat alone in his office for hours. He pulled the entire case file apart, examining every piece of evidence with fresh eyes. The jewelry Greville had been carrying in Jacksonville. He'd claimed it was Eleanor's, but could it have belonged to someone else? The warehouse where Eleanor's body was found. Greville claimed to have worked there, but had anyone actually verified that? The timeline of events kept shifting in Marcus's mind, becoming less certain, more malleable. That night, Marcus drove to the warehouse district. The building where Eleanor had been buried was still standing, now converted into storage for a shipping company. The floorboards had been replaced decades ago, but Marcus stood in the exact spot where her body had been found and tried to reconstruct the murder in his mind. Greville's confession had been so specific about the location, so certain in its details. But what if Greville had only known about it because someone had told him? What if the confession was an elaborate performance, a man taking the fall for a crime he didn't commit? No, that was absurd. Why would an innocent man confess to murder? But the doubt had taken root. The next morning, Marcus received a phone call from a detective in Jacksonville named William Porter. Porter had been investigating Greville's background more thoroughly, trying to build a stronger case for the prosecutor. "I found something," Porter said, his voice tight with urgency. "Something that doesn't add up. Greville claimed he was working at the warehouse when Eleanor disappeared, right? Well, I pulled the warehouse employment records from 1939. Greville wasn't on the payroll until 1940. He didn't work there when Eleanor was killed." Marcus's blood went cold. "Are you certain?" "Absolutely certain. The records are clear. Greville came to Tampa in 1940, not 1939. He couldn't have murdered Eleanor because he wasn't even in the city." Marcus hung up the phone and sat in stunned silence. His entire case had just collapsed. The confession he'd been so certain about, the arrest that had promised justice, was built on a foundation of lies. But whose lies? Greville's? Or Marcus's own blind certainty? That afternoon, Marcus went to see Thomas Greville in his holding cell. Greville looked smaller now, diminished by the weight of incarceration. When Marcus approached, Greville's face registered fear. "Why did you confess?" Marcus asked without preamble. Greville looked away. "I told you, I was tired of running." "You weren't in Tampa in 1939, Marcus said. "You came to the city in 1940. You couldn't have killed Eleanor." For a long moment, Greville said nothing. Then, slowly, tears began to fall from his eyes. Not tears of guilt this time, but tears of desperation. "I was afraid," Greville whispered. "When you came to get me, when you read me those rights, when you started talking about Eleanor Hartwell, I was so afraid. You had this certainty in your eyes, this absolute conviction that I was guilty. And I thought if I confessed, if I just gave you what you wanted, you'd leave me alone. I thought the system would work itself out, that the truth would come out eventually." "The truth," Marcus said bitterly. "You lied. You confessed to a crime you didn't commit." "I know a murderer," Greville said suddenly, and Marcus's attention snapped back to him. "I knew one. In Jacksonville, when I first left Tampa, a man named Charles Whitmore. He was obsessed with a woman named Eleanor once. I remember because he talked about her all the time, how she'd rejected him, how she'd humiliated him at some warehouse. He said he'd made her pay for it. I was young and stupid and scared, so I never reported it. But when you came for me, when you started talking about Eleanor, I realized who you were really looking for. Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him. Where is Whitmore now? Dead, Greville said. He died 3 years ago. Drunk driving accident on the interstate. The truth, when it finally arrived, came too late and too broken. Charles Whitmore, who died in 1938, no, wait, Marcus checked the records again. Whitmore had died in 1938, which was a year before Eleanor Hartwell's murder. That couldn't be right either. Marcus spent the next week unraveling the lies, following thread after thread into darkness. Whitmore had existed, but he died in 1941, not 1938. The timeline shifted again. Whitmore had been in Jacksonville in 1939, working as a day laborer at the docks. He'd had a history of violence against women. He'd had a sister named Eleanor who'd rejected him and refused to speak to him. He'd had access to the warehouses in Tampa through a shipping company connection. But Whitmore was dead now, had been for 3 years, and there was no way to prosecute him. The truth had arrived too late, buried under decades of time and error and human limitation. Marcus stood before the press the following week and announced that Thomas Greville was being released. The charges were being dropped. There was insufficient evidence to prove his guilt, and significant evidence suggesting his innocence. The real killer, he explained, had likely been Charles Whitmore, who died years before the murder could be solved. The community's reaction was volatile. Some people celebrated Greville's release as a triumph of justice. Others condemned Marcus as an incompetent detective who'd nearly sent an innocent man to the electric chair. Still others insisted that Greville was guilty and that Marcus was covering up his own failure. Ruth Hartwell received the news differently. She called Marcus and asked him to visit her at home. When he arrived, she was sitting in her garden, looking at Eleanor's photograph in a frame. "At least now I know," Ruth said quietly. "At least now I know it wasn't random. There was a reason. Eleanor was killed by someone who loved her once, in his own twisted way. That doesn't make it better, but it makes it comprehensible. It makes her death mean something." Marcus stood beside her, and for the first time in weeks, he felt the weight begin to lift slightly. Not completely. The weight of Eleanor Hartwell's case would never fully leave him, but enough to breathe. "The truth is messy," Ruth continued. "It's not clean like in the movies. It's fragmented and broken and arrives too late. But it's still the truth. And that matters." Marcus nodded, understanding finally what Ruth had known all along. That justice wasn't about certainty. It was about seeking. It was about refusing to let the past stay buried. It was about continuing to look, even when the answers were painful and incomplete. If you've made it this far, you're seeing a story about how truth is complicated, how certainty can be dangerous, and how a mother's love can survive even when justice fails. If you're moved by this moment, if you're feeling the weight of Eleanor's story and the complexity of Marcus's struggle, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are coming, stories about the fragmented truth that defines our lives. Subscribe now, and let's continue this journey together. The real revelations are still ahead. Marcus wept during that phone call, not from sadness but from the weight of grace that Ruth had offered him. She died 2 months later, having finally found peace. At her funeral, hundreds of people came. People whose cases Marcus had helped solve, families seeking answers, detectives learning from his example. Eleanor Hartwell's grave was decorated with flowers. Her photograph, the same one that had appeared in newspapers 23 years earlier, was placed beside her headstone. A young journalist who'd been researching the case for a historical article stood at the grave and whispered a prayer for Eleanor, for her mother, for all the time that had been lost to uncertainty and misdirection. Marcus stood at that grave and understood, finally, that Eleanor's death had meant something. Not because it had been solved perfectly, but because it had been sought persistently, because it had demanded truth, even when truth was painful and incomplete. Because a detective had chosen to continue seeking even after failure nearly broke him. The mystery of Eleanor Hartwell hadn't ended cleanly. It had ended in fragments, in partial understanding, in the recognition that some questions can never be fully answered. But in that fragmented ending was a kind of grace, the recognition that the seeking itself was sacred, that the refusal to abandon the search was its own form of justice. By 1955, Marcus Webb had become a legend in law enforcement circles. He was 66 years old, officially retired for 3 years, yet more active than ever. His small office, located in a converted house near downtown Tampa, had become an unofficial headquarters for cold case investigations. The walls were covered with photographs of victims, timelines of events, and maps marking locations. It looked less like an office and more like a shrine to the pursuit of truth. It was in this office that Marcus received an unexpected visitor on a humid Tuesday afternoon. A woman in her late 30s, dressed in professional clothes, carrying a leather satchel. Her name was Eleanor Hartwell Jr., Eleanor's niece, named after her aunt. "My mother asked me to find you," Eleanor Jr. said, settling into a chair across from Marcus's desk. "Before she passed, she made me promise to tell you something. She wanted you to know that you saved her life." Marcus looked puzzled. "I didn't save your aunt's life, unfortunately. I came too late." "No," Eleanor Jr. said. "You saved my mother's life. My mother, Ruth's daughter, Eleanor's sister. She was consumed by grief after Eleanor died. For years, she couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't function. She was dying slowly, from the inside out. But when you continued investigating, when you refused to give up, when you finally found the truth about Charles Whitmore, something changed in her. She realized that her sister's death had been witnessed, had been pursued, had mattered enough that a man would dedicate decades to understanding it." Eleanor Jr. opened her satchel and withdrew a letter, handwritten in careful script. "My mother wrote this before she died," Eleanor Jr. explained. "She wanted you to have it." Marcus opened the letter with trembling hands. It was dated 6 months earlier, written in the careful hand of a woman near the end of her life. "Dear Detective Webb, I never thanked you properly. I spent so many years angry with you, doubting you, convinced that you had failed. But as I've grown older, as I've watched you transform your failure into wisdom, I've come to understand something profound. My sister Eleanor was taken from me by a man consumed by rage and obsession. That was always going to be true. But whether her death would be remembered, whether it would mean anything, whether anyone would care enough to seek justice even when the path was unclear, that was not always going to be true. That depended on you. You chose to continue seeking. You chose to doubt your own certainty. You chose to risk your reputation and your career to find the truth, even when that truth was incomplete and arrived too late. In doing so, you gave Eleanor's death meaning. You transformed a tragedy into a testament to human persistence. You showed me that justice isn't always about convicting someone in a courtroom. Sometimes it's about refusing to forget, refusing to let the dead be erased from history, refusing to accept comfortable lies when uncomfortable truths are possible. I am at peace now. Eleanor is at peace now. And it is because of you. With gratitude and respect. Ruth Hartwell's daughter. Marcus read the letter 3 times, each time feeling something settle more deeply within him. The weight he'd carried for so long, the guilt of nearly prosecuting an innocent man, the shame of the case's incomplete resolution, the sense that he'd failed, began to transform into something else. Not redemption exactly, something quieter and more true. Eleanor Jr. stayed in Marcus's office for 2 hours. She told him stories about her mother, about the years of grief and slow healing, about how the resolution of Eleanor's case had given her mother permission to finally move forward with her life. She told him about the children her mother had raised, the grandchildren now being born, the legacy that Eleanor Hartwell had left behind not through her life but through the investigation of her death. "My mother always said," Eleanor Jr. reflected, "that the worst thing that could happen to a dead person is to be forgotten. It's worse than any physical suffering. It's a kind of death beyond death. By continuing to investigate, by refusing to forget, you prevented that from happening to Eleanor." After Eleanor Jr. left, Marcus sat alone in his office as the afternoon light began to fade. He walked to the wall where Eleanor Hartwell's photograph was pinned, the same image from 1939. A young woman with gentle eyes and a tentative smile, forever frozen in time. He understood now, with absolute clarity, what had taken him so long to grasp. The investigation of Eleanor Hartwell's death had never been about perfect justice or flawless prosecution. It had been about witness. It had been about the refusal to let a human life be erased from history. It had been about saying to the world, this person mattered. This person existed. This person was loved and lost and deserves to be remembered. That evening, Marcus began writing a book. Not a detective novel or a true crime account. A meditation on the nature of seeking, on the relationship between certainty and truth, on what it means to pursue justice in a world where perfect answers are impossible. He wrote about Eleanor Hartwell, about Charles Whitmore, about Thomas Greville, about Ruth Hartwell. He wrote about the years of misdirection and the slow, painful arrival of truth. The book took him 2 years to complete. He titled it The Space Between Certainty and Truth, Reflections on Justice. It was published in a small print run by a local Tampa publisher, barely attracting notice beyond the police community. But for those who read it, especially for younger detectives and investigators, it became something of a sacred text, a guide to humility in the face of human complexity. In 1957, 2 years after Eleanor Jr.'s visit, the Tampa Police Department named their Cold Case Division after Marcus Webb. The Marcus Webb Cold Case Division was established with a mandate to review unsolved cases with the kind of persistence and humility that Marcus had demonstrated throughout his career. Young detectives rotated through the division, learning from retired investigators and from Marcus himself, who served as a volunteer consultant until his health began to decline. Eleanor Hartwell's case file was placed in a special archive, marked as a template for how incomplete justice could still be meaningful justice. Every detective who worked in the Marcus Webb division was required to read the full case file and to understand not just what had been solved, but how the solving had been achieved through the combination of persistence, humility, and willingness to embrace uncertainty. On Eleanor's birthday in 1958, now nearly 40 years after her death, a small memorial service was held at her grave. The Tampa Police Commissioner attended. The mayor attended. Eleanor Jr. attended, bringing her children and grandchildren. And Marcus attended, moving slowly now, his health fragile but his presence substantial. At the grave, Eleanor Jr. placed fresh flowers and read a passage from her mother's letter. The police commissioner announced that the case would be formally memorialized in the department's historical records, not as a failure but as a triumph of human persistence. Marcus knelt at Eleanor's grave, his knees protesting the movement, and placed his hand on the headstone. He whispered words that no one else could hear, words of apology for the years of investigation that had come too late, words of gratitude for the opportunity to seek truth even when that truth was incomplete. As he stood to leave, supported by Eleanor Jr., he looked back at the grave one final time. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the cemetery, and for a moment Marcus could almost see Eleanor Hartwell herself. Not as a corpse buried beneath the floorboards of a warehouse, but as a young woman whole and alive and remembered. The pain didn't disappear. The loss didn't become bearable. But it transformed into something else, into testimony, into witness, into the collective memory of a community that had refused to forget. Eleanor Hartwell was dead. That would always be true. But she was not erased. She was not forgotten. She lived on in the investigation of her death, in the lessons that investigation had taught, in the young detectives who learned her story and learned from it the importance of seeking truth with humility. And in that living memory, in that persistent witness, there was a kind of peace. 23 years later, in 1981, the Marcus Webb Cold Case Division had solved 47 cases that had been dormant for decades. Young detectives trained in Webb's methodology had brought closure to families who thought they'd never find answers. The Tampa Police Department had become a model for cold case investigation, with departments across the country sending their investigators to study Webb's approach. Marcus Webb died in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in early March, at the age of 92. He'd lived long enough to see his methods vindicated, long enough to witness the transformation of law enforcement's approach to historical crimes. He'd lived long enough to know that Eleanor Hartwell would not be forgotten. His funeral was attended by over 300 people. Detectives from across Florida, from other states, from the federal government came to pay respects. Police commissioners gave speeches about his legacy. Young officers spoke about how his book had changed their understanding of justice. Eleanor Jr., now in her 80s, placed a hand on Marcus's casket and whispered words of gratitude. But the true measure of Marcus Webb's life wasn't in the eulogies or the official recognitions. It was in the cases that continued to be solved in his name, in the methodology that bore his imprint, in the philosophy of humble seeking that he'd passed on to a generation of investigators. In 1983, 2 years after Marcus's death, a documentary filmmaker named David Chun became interested in Eleanor Hartwell's case. Chun had read Marcus Webb's book as a young man and had become fascinated by the intersection of justice, time, and memory. He spent 18 months interviewing everyone involved in the case: detectives, family members, neighbors, historians. He traveled to Jacksonville to research Charles Whitmore's background. He visited the warehouse where Eleanor's body had been discovered, now converted into a trendy art gallery. The documentary, titled The Space Between: Seeking Justice in the Eleanor Hartwell Case, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 1985. It won the Grand Jury Prize for Documentary Feature. More importantly, it brought Eleanor Hartwell's story to a national audience. Suddenly, people across America knew about Eleanor, about Marcus Webb, about the complexity of seeking truth in incomplete circumstances. The documentary sparked renewed interest in cold cases nationwide. Police departments that had been ignoring their historical files suddenly began allocating resources to review them. The FBI created a national cold case unit. Universities began offering courses on cold case investigation, using Eleanor Hartwell's case as the primary example of how persistence could overcome time's erosion. In 1987, the state of Florida passed the Eleanor Hartwell Justice Act, legislation that required all unsolved murder cases to be reviewed every 5 years, and that provided funding for cold case investigations. Governor Bob Martinez signed the bill at a ceremony attended by Eleanor Jr., now 89 years old and in declining health, and by David Chun, the filmmaker who'd helped resurrect Eleanor's story. Eleanor Jr. died that same year, at age 90, having lived to see her aunt's name inscribed in state law. At her funeral, her children and grandchildren spoke about how Eleanor's death, though tragic, had become a catalyst for justice for countless other victims. Eleanor's legacy, they said, was measured not in what had been taken from her but in what her loss had given to others: the gift of persistent seeking, the refusal to accept that some lives don't matter enough to investigate. By the 1990s, the Eleanor Hartwell case had become a fixture in criminology textbooks. Universities taught it in criminal justice programs. It was referenced in Supreme Court decisions about the statute of limitations for cold cases. It was the subject of multiple true crime podcasts and documentaries. Eleanor Hartwell, who'd lived only 26 years, had become a permanent figure in American legal history. But perhaps the most profound impact of Eleanor's case was more subtle, less visible. In police stations and detective bureaus across the country, investigators working on cold cases would sometimes pause and think about Marcus Webb's philosophy. They would remind themselves that perfect certainty was impossible, that humble seeking was more valuable than confident prosecution, that the absence of a perfect answer didn't mean the search wasn't worth conducting. In 2005, 66 years after Eleanor Hartwell's body had been discovered, the Tampa Police Department opened a small museum dedicated to Marcus Webb and the cold case division he'd inspired. The museum contained artifacts from Eleanor's case, her photograph, Marcus's personal notes, letters from Ruth Hartwell, David Chen's documentary on. Visitors to the museum, many of them young people considering careers in law enforcement, would stand before Eleanor Hartwell's photograph and read the placard beneath it: Eleanor and Hartwell, 1913 to 1939. Murdered by Charles Whitmore. Investigation led by Detective Marcus Webb. Her case teaches us that justice is not always swift, not always perfect, but always possible when we refuse to forget. In 2015, 76 years after Eleanor's death, A television producer named Sarah Okonkwo discovered Marcus Webb's book in a used bookstore in Atlanta. She read it in 2 days, then immediately began researching Eleanor's story. Sarah was struck not by the case itself but by Webb's philosophy. His understanding that seeking truth was more important than achieving certainty, that incomplete answers were better than comfortable ignorance. Sarah spent 3 years developing a television series based on the Eleanor Hartwell case and Marcus Webb's life. The series, titled The Space Between, aired on a major network in 2018 to critical acclaim. It was nominated for multiple Emmy Awards. More importantly, it introduced Eleanor Hartwell's story to a new generation, to young people who'd never heard of Marcus Webb or David Chen's documentary. The television series sparked a new wave of interest in Eleanor's case. True crime enthusiasts created podcasts analyzing every detail of the investigation. Amateur historians wrote blog posts about Charles Whitmore's background. A journalist named Michael Torres published a full-length biography of Marcus Webb that became a bestseller. But perhaps most significantly, the television series inspired a new generation of cold case investigators. Young detectives who watched the series found themselves drawn to Marcus Webb's philosophy. They began requesting to work in cold case divisions. They began reading Webb's book as if it were scripture. They began approaching their investigations with the humility and persistence that Webb had championed. By 2020, 81 years after Eleanor Hartwell's death, the Eleanor Hartwell Justice Act had been expanded and re-implemented in 43 states. Cold case units that had barely existed in the 1980s were now fully staffed and well-funded. Hundreds of cases that had been gathering dust for decades were being systematically reviewed and investigated. And buried within all of this, within the documentaries and television series and books and podcasts and legislation, was Eleanor Hartwell's quiet legacy. She had not lived a remarkable life. She had lived a brief, ordinary life in a small Florida city. But her death, investigated with persistence and humility, had become a catalyst for transformation in how America pursued justice. Eleanor's grave in Tampa remained a place of pilgrimage. Visitors left flowers. Young detectives visited before beginning their careers, seeking inspiration from a woman they'd never met, but whose story had shaped their vocations. Eleanor Jr.'s children and grandchildren visited on Eleanor's birthday and on the anniversary of her death, maintaining the family's tradition of remembrance. In 2023, 84 years after Eleanor Hartwell's murder, a large monument was erected in downtown Tampa, dedicated to Eleanor and to Marcus Webb. The monument featured Eleanor's photograph, the same gentle, tentative image from 1939, and beneath it, an inscription, "To Eleanor and Hartwell and Detective Marcus Webb. To all victims whose voices have been silenced. To all seekers who refuse to forget. To the understanding that justice is not always swift, but it is never truly beyond reach when we persist in seeking truth." The monument became a gathering place. On significant dates, crowds would assemble. Police officers and families of victims, young detectives and retired investigators, historians and students. They would stand before Eleanor's photograph and remember not just her death but her life. Not just the tragedy but the persistence that had transformed that tragedy into meaning.